My name is Eleanor. I am 64 years old. If you were to see me walking down the aisles of the grocery store, carefully selecting Honeycrisp apples, or sweeping the autumn leaves off the front porch of my home in the Chicago suburbs, you probably wouldn't look twice. Society has a very specific way of looking at older women, particularly older Black women. They look right through us. We become part of the background scenery, comforting, quiet, and entirely harmless. For the last 20 years, that invisibility was my greatest comfort. I was Arthur Vance's wife. That was my title, my job, and my entire world. I traded sharp tailored suits for soft knit cardigans. I traded the adrenaline of a courtroom for the quiet rhythm of baking, gardening, and managing the delicate ecosystem of a 10,000 square foot home. I wanted the peace. I craved it. But peace, I've learned, is a fragile thing. When the man who anchored that peace dies, you are suddenly left standing alone in a very large, very cold room, surrounded by people who have been waiting a long time to remind you of your place. I'm glad you're here today. Pour yourself a warm cup of coffee, settle in, and please, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Today, I want to tell you a story about grief, about the polite cruelty of greedy men, and about the dangerous mistake of assuming a quiet woman is a weak one. 2:15, The Final Days. Before I can tell you about the betrayal, you need to understand the love. Arthur was a good man. He was a white, self-made logistics magnate, 70 years old when his heart finally gave out. We had met 22 years ago at a charity gala I didn't want to attend. I was exhausted, carrying the heavy, invisible armor of my past life, and he was a widower with a teenage son, trying to navigate a world that felt too quiet. We found refuge in each other. His decline didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing theft over 2 years. The man who used to lift me off my feet in the kitchen slowly became a man who needed help holding a glass of water. I didn't hire a team of full-time nurses to take over. I did the heavy lifting. I learned how to read the oxygen concentrator, how to carefully crush his beta blockers into applesauce when swallowing became too difficult. I spent countless nights sleeping in a stiff armchair beside his hospital bed set up in the living room, listening to the rhythmic hiss-click of the machines, terrified that if I closed my eyes, he would slip away alone in the dark. During those 2 years, his son, Desmond, visited exactly 4 times. Desmond was 35, impeccably groomed, and possessed the kind of effortless arrogance that comes from never having to earn your own safety net. When he did visit, he didn't sit by his father's bed and hold his hand. He stood near the doorway, shifting his weight, checking his phone, complaining about the smell of antiseptic. "You should really just put him in a facility, Eleanor," Desmond told me once, keeping his voice low as Arthur dozed. "This is exhausting to watch. You look terrible." He didn't say it out of concern for me. He said it because the reality of his father's mortality made him uncomfortable, and Desmond Vance did not tolerate discomfort. Arthur passed away on a Tuesday morning. The funeral was held 4 days later. Chicago in November is unforgiving. The wind coming off Lake Michigan doesn't just chill you, it cuts right through to the bone. I stood beneath the green canvas canopy by the open grave, clutching a crumpled tissue in one hand and the arm of Beatrice, Bea, with the other. Bea had been my housekeeper, my confidant, and my closest friend for 15 years. She was a Black woman a few years older than me, with kind eyes and hands that knew the rhythm of hard work. When my knees threatened to buckle as the polished oak casket was lowered into the earth, it was Bea who held me steady. Across the rectangular hole in the ground stood Desmond. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that fit him with surgical precision. The collar of his black cashmere overcoat was turned up against the wind. He wasn't crying. His eyes were dry, scanning the small crowd of business associates and distant relatives. Every so often his gaze would land on me. It wasn't a look of shared grief. It was an evaluative look, like a man assessing a piece of furniture he was planning to throw away. Standing half a step behind Desmond was Sterling Hayes. I knew Sterling by reputation long before Arthur got sick. He was a partner at one of the most expensive estate and probate law firms in the city. Sterling was tall, thin, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He had the bored, detached aura of a man who calculated human tragedy in billable hours. He didn't look at the grave at all. He looked at his phone, occasionally leaning in to whisper something to Desmond, who would nod slightly in response. "Lord have mercy," Bea whispered to me, her voice thick with unshed tears. That boy hasn't shed a single tear for his own flesh and blood. He's processing it in his own way, Bea, I murmured automatically. It was the lie I had been telling myself for 20 years to keep the peace. After the minister finished the final prayer, people began to disperse. I stayed behind, dropping a single white rose onto the wood of the casket. When I finally turned to walk back to the waiting town car, Desmond intercepted me on the gravel path. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was smooth, perfectly modulated for a funeral. "Desmond, thank you for handling the arrangements with the florist. The lilies were Arthur's favorite." "Of course." He put his hands in his coat pockets. He looked past me toward the distant city skyline. "Listen, I know today is difficult. I'll give you a few days to rest, but we have a lot of administrative things to sort out. The house, the accounts. Dad left things complicated." I frowned, pulling my coat tighter around myself. "Complicated? Arthur was very organized, Desmond. The estate planning was finalized years ago." Desmond offered a small, tight smile, the kind of smile you give a child who doesn't understand adult conversation. "Things change, Eleanor. I'll come by the house on Friday. We'll have tea. We'll get it all sorted." He didn't wait for my response. He simply turned and walked toward Sterling Hayes, leaving me standing in the freezing wind. The next 3 days were a blur of suffocating silence. When you live with a sick person, the house is loud. There are visiting nurses, the hum of medical equipment, the schedule of medications. When they are gone, the silence rings in your ears. I found myself walking into the living room at 2 p.m., expecting to check Arthur's blood pressure, only to stare at the empty corner where his hospital bed used to be. Bea was my lifeline. She came over every morning, even on her days off. We didn't talk much. We sat in the kitchen, drinking strong black coffee, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "You need to eat something, Ellie," Bea said on Thursday morning, sliding a plate of buttered toast toward me. "You're fading away right in front of me." "I'm not hungry, Bea." I traced the rim of my coffee mug. I don't know what to do with my hands anymore. For 2 years, my hands belonged to him." Bea reached across the table and covered my hands with hers. "You gave that man the best years of his life, Eleanor. He went peaceful because he knew you were right there. Don't you let anyone, especially that cold-blooded boy of his, tell you different." I smiled weakly. "Desmond is just grieving." Bea snorted, taking her hand back to pick up her coffee. "Desmond Vance is grieving the fact that he couldn't get his hands on the checkbook sooner. I see the way he looks at this house, Ellie. He looks at it like a real estate listing. You better watch your back." I brushed off her warning. I was too tired to engage in family politics. I thought the worst thing that could happen was that Desmond and I would have a stiff, uncomfortable relationship for the rest of our lives. I severely underestimated the depth of his entitlement. Friday arrived with a heavy downpour. At precisely 10 a.m., the doorbell rang. I had prepared a pot of Earl Grey tea and set out some scones, trying to maintain the grace Arthur would have wanted. When I opened the door, Desmond stepped into the foyer, shaking his umbrella. Sterling Hayes was right behind him, carrying a thick brown leather briefcase. "Desmond, Mr. Hayes," I said, stepping aside. "I wasn't expecting legal counsel for a family tea." "Sterling is a family friend, Eleanor," Desmond said smoothly, handing me his wet umbrella without looking at me. And given the complexities of Dad's estate, I thought it best he be here to help explain things. I led them into the formal living room. They sat together on the long beige sofa. I sat opposite them in a high-backed armchair. I poured the tea, the porcelain clinking softly in the quiet room. Desmond leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked around the room, taking in the crown molding, the Persian rugs, the original oil paintings Arthur had collected over decades. "This house is massive, Eleanor," Desmond began, his tone dripping with manufactured concern. 10,000 square feet. The property taxes alone are astronomical. And the upkeep? It's simply too much for a woman your age to handle alone. I kept my expression neutral. "I manage the house just fine, Desmond. Bea helps me, and we have a landscaping service." Sterling Hayes set his teacup down and folded his hands in his lap. "Mrs. Vance, Desmond's primary concern is your well-being. The grieving process can cloud judgment. We want to ensure you are taken care of in an environment that is safe and manageable." "I am safe right here," I said, my voice firming up slightly. "What exactly are you trying to say, Desmond?" Desmond sighed, a heavy theatrical sound. He looked at Sterling, who gave him a slight nod. Sterling reached down, unlatched his leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick manila folder. He placed it carefully on the glass coffee table and pushed it toward me. "Mrs. Vance," Sterling said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "My client is formally contesting the validity of Arthur Vance's most recent will, the will executed 3 years ago, which left the bulk of the estate, including this property, to you." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I stared at the folder, but I didn't reach for it. Contesting it? On what grounds? "On the grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity," Sterling recited smoothly. "Arthur was suffering from severe cardiovascular disease. He was heavily medicated. We believe that you, as his sole caregiver, isolated him from his family and used your position to coerce him into altering his estate planning." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands gripped the armrests of my chair. "Coerce him? I was his wife. I wiped his brow when he had fevers. I slept on the floor. You didn't even call him on Father's Day, Desmond." Desmond's jaw tightened, a flash of genuine anger breaking through his polite facade. "You kept me away, Eleanor. You controlled his phone. You controlled his schedule. You manipulated a sick, dying old man into leaving a multi-million-dollar logistics empire to a woman who hasn't worked a day in 20 years. "That is a lie," I whispered, the sheer audacity of the accusation stealing my breath. "It's a matter for the probate court to decide," Sterling interjected calmly, sliding another piece of paper across the table. "However, given the serious nature of these allegations, we cannot allow the estate's assets to be vulnerable while the litigation is pending." 3 days before Arthur passed, when it became clear he was no longer lucid, Desmond enacted a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney, a document Arthur signed 5 years ago. I looked at the second piece of paper. The legal jargon swam before my eyes. "What does that mean?" I asked, looking up at Sterling. "It means," Sterling said, offering that thin, cold smile, "that my client has secured an emergency injunction. The estate is now under Desmond's administrative control pending the outcome of the trial. All assets are temporarily frozen. We just want to ensure Dad's legacy isn't squandered, Eleanor. You understand." Desmond stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "We found a lovely assisted living community in Scottsdale, Eleanor. I'm willing to pay the first 6 months' rent out of my own pocket. You have 30 days to vacate this property." They didn't shout. They didn't break anything. They just politely dropped a bomb on my entire existence, drank their tea, and walked out the front door. After the front door clicked shut behind Desmond and Sterling, the house felt impossibly large, like a cathedral emptied of its congregation. I stood in the foyer for a long time, listening to the rain lash against the leaded glass windows. I walked back into the living room. The teacups were still warm. The manila folder sat on the glass coffee table, an ugly, jagged thing interrupting the carefully curated peace of my home. I reached out and touched the edge of the thick parchment paper. Emergency injunction. Temporary restraining order on estate assets. Petition to invalidate last will and testament. The legal terms didn't frighten me. What frightened me was the meticulous, quiet violence of what Desmond had just done. He hadn't come here to argue. He had come here to inform me that I was already bleeding out, and he was just waiting for me to pass out from the blood loss. I needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I needed a litigator who could go toe-to-toe with Sterling Hayes. Sterling was a shark who billed $800 an hour. To even get a meeting with someone of his caliber, I would need a retainer of at least $50,000. Arthur had always been a protector. 5 years ago, when his heart first started showing signs of failure, he insisted on setting up a private, high-yield savings account solely in my name at the First National Bank of Chicago. "Just in case, Ellie," he had said, kissing my forehead. "I don't want you ever having to ask anyone for permission to buy groceries or pay the light bill." There was over $200,000 in that account. It was my safety net. I went upstairs, changed out of my cardigan into a structured wool blazer, picked up my leather handbag, and drove downtown through the pouring rain. The downtown branch of First National smelled of polished granite, wet umbrellas, and old money. I walked past the tellers and approached the glass-walled office of Richard Davis, the branch manager. Richard was a man Arthur and I had shared dinner with on multiple occasions. He knew my favorite wine. He knew the names of Arthur's favorite golf courses. When Richard saw me standing outside his door, he didn't smile. He didn't stand up to greet me. He looked at his computer screen, swallowed hard, and slowly motioned for me to come in. "Eleanor," he said, his voice tight, lacking its usual warmth. I was hoping you wouldn't come down here today. I am so deeply sorry about Arthur. I sat in one of the plush leather chairs opposite his desk. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that. But I'm here because I need to make a wire transfer from my personal savings account. I need to retain legal counsel. Richard closed his eyes for a brief second. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed his forehead. Eleanor, I can't do that. I frowned, adjusting the strap of my handbag on my lap. I'm not asking to touch the joint checking accounts, Richard. I know those are frozen in probate because Desmond is contesting the will. I am asking to withdraw from my individual savings account. The one ending in 4409. It's solely in my name. Richard leaned forward, clasping his hands tightly together on his desk. He looked miserable. Eleanor, Sterling Hayes filed an ex parte motion yesterday afternoon. They didn't just freeze the joint accounts. They placed a hold on your personal savings account as well. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. On what grounds? That account is mine. On the grounds of commingled funds, Richard explained gently, though the words hit like physical blows. Desmond's legal team argued that since you haven't held formal employment in 20 years, the initial seed money and all subsequent deposits into that account originated from Arthur's corporate holdings. They are claiming those funds are part of the contested estate and that you might attempt to squander or hide them before the trial. I stared at him. They think I'm going to steal my own money. They are protecting the estate's assets under the medical and financial power of attorney Desmond enacted just before Arthur's passing, Richard said, quoting the legal doctrine with the hollow tone of a man reading a hostage script. The judge granted a temporary freeze until ownership can be definitively proven in probate court. I am legally barred from authorizing any withdrawals, Eleanor, even for $100. If I do, I'll be in contempt of a federal court order. I opened my purse. I pulled out my wallet and counted the cash inside. I had exactly $42.75. Desmond knew this. Sterling Hayes knew this. They had mapped out my entire financial existence and systematically cut every single wire. They knew that if I couldn't access my money, I couldn't hire a lawyer. If I couldn't hire a lawyer, I would be forced to face Sterling Hayes alone in a courtroom. It would be a slaughter. I would lose the house. I would lose Arthur's legacy. I would be left with nothing but a suitcase and a bus ticket to a cheap assisted living facility. I'm sorry, Eleanor, Richard whispered, looking down at his desk. My hands are completely tied. I know, Richard, I said softly. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer with trembling hands. Thank you for your time. I walked out of the bank and into the cold Chicago rain. I didn't open my umbrella. I just let the icy water hit my face, hoping it would wake me up from this nightmare. I got into my car, shut the door, and locked it. The silence of the sedan was absolute. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and for the first time since Arthur died, I broke down. I wept. I wept for the man I had loved, the man who had died believing he had protected me. I wept for the sheer, suffocating unfairness of a system designed to crush people who don't have the capital to defend themselves. After 10 minutes, the tears stopped. I reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror. I looked at my own reflection. I saw a 64-year-old black woman. My natural hair, heavily streaked with silver, was damp and flattened against my forehead. My eyes were red and swollen. The lines around my mouth, carved by 20 years of smiling at Arthur's jokes, suddenly looked like scars of exhaustion. Society looked at this face and saw a victim. Desmond looked at this face and saw an uneducated, vulnerable old woman who would fold under pressure. I stared into my own dark brown eyes. Deeper than the grief. Deeper than the exhaustion. Is that who you are? I asked myself in the quiet car. Are you just Arthur's widow? Are you going to let a spoiled boy who embezzled his father's love bully you out of your own home? A memory flickered in the back of my mind. It was a memory from 1998. The smell of cheap coffee in a federal building. The weight of a thick blue legal binder in my hands. The sound of a corrupt Wall Street banker weeping on the witness stand after I had systematically dismantled his alibi over 4 grueling hours of cross-examination. My breath hitched. My hands slowly uncurled from the steering wheel. I wasn't just Arthur Vance's wife. I had chosen to be his wife because I loved him. But before I was his piece, I was something else entirely. I had spent 15 years building a career that terrified men much smarter and much more dangerous than Desmond Vance. I started the engine. The heater blasted warm air over my damp clothes. I didn't drive toward a cheap lawyer's office to beg for pro bono representation. I drove home. When I pulled into the driveway, the 10,000 square foot house didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt like a fortress, and it was my fortress. I walked through the front door, bypassed the kitchen, and climbed the sweeping mahogany staircase to the second floor. I walked down the long hallway, pulled the cord to lower the attic stairs, and climbed up into the dusty, silent space beneath the roof. The attic smelled of old wood and mothballs. In the far corner, beneath a canvas tarp, sat a heavy, brass-bound cedar chest. I hadn't opened it in almost 2 decades. When Arthur and I got married, I had packed away my old life, wanting a clean slate, wanting a home devoid of the darkness I used to prosecute. I knelt on the dusty floorboards. I took a small brass key from a chain around my neck, a key Arthur had insisted I keep, even when I told him I'd never need it again. The lock clicked open with a sharp, heavy snap. I lifted the lid. The scent of aged paper and binding glue wafted up. Inside were the remnants of Eleanor Carter. I reached in and pulled out a heavy wooden plaque. The brass plate was tarnished, but the engraved letters were still perfectly legible. Eleanor Vance Carter, Chief Federal Prosecutor, Northern District of Illinois. Beneath the plaque were stacks of leather-bound journals, my old case notes, trial strategies, precedents I had memorized. I ran my fingers over the spine of a book on advanced financial forensics, the very book I had used to trace offshore shell companies for the FBI. At the bottom of the chest was a folded piece of heavy parchment, my law degree from Georgetown University, graduating magna cum laude, and my active bar association card, which I had quietly renewed every year out of pure habit, never telling anyone. I sat on the attic floor for 2 hours, surrounded by the physical evidence of a woman who had never lost a case. I read through my old cross-examination transcripts. I felt the rhythm of the legal language returning to my blood, like muscle memory waking up after a long sleep. Desmond thought I couldn't read a balance sheet. Sterling Hayes thought I didn't understand the rules of civil procedure. They thought they had trapped a harmless rabbit. They had no idea they had just locked themselves in a cage with a lioness. I carried the journals and the plaque downstairs to the kitchen table. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. I didn't have $50,000 for a retainer. I didn't need it. I had my bar card. In the state of Illinois, an individual has the absolute right to represent themselves pro se in a civil proceeding. Usually it's a terrible idea. Usually it's financial suicide. But I wasn't an ordinary civilian. I spent the entire weekend at that kitchen table. I didn't cry anymore. I drafted motions on yellow legal pads. I printed out the limited financial disclosures Sterling had filed with the court regarding the estate. I didn't just read the numbers. I dissected them. I looked for the gaps. I looked for the silence between the transactions. Desmond wanted a war over his father's legacy. He was about to get one. On Monday morning, I showered, pinned my graying hair back into a tight, severe bun, and put on a tailored navy blue suit that had hung in the back of my closet for 20 years. It was a little tight across the shoulders, but it felt like armor. I packed my worn leather tote bag with 3 sharpened pencils, 2 yellow legal pads, and a single file folder. I didn't bring my law degree or my prosecutor's plaque. I didn't want them to know who I was. Not yet. I wanted them to walk into that courtroom believing their own arrogant lies. I wanted them comfortable, because a comfortable liar makes mistakes. I walked out the front door, locked it behind me, and drove toward the Cook County Courthouse. The storm was coming, but for the first time in a month, I wasn't afraid of the rain. I was the storm. Cook County Courthouse is not a place designed for comfort. It is an imposing structure of cold marble, echoing hallways, and heavy oak doors that seem to swallow the light. It is a building designed to make ordinary people feel very, very small. When I walked through the metal detectors on Monday morning, holding my worn leather tote bag, I didn't feel small. I felt the familiar electric hum of the arena. It had been 20 years, but the smell of floor wax, stale coffee, and nervous sweat was exactly the same. I found courtroom 302 on the 3rd floor. I pushed open the double doors and walked down the center aisle. Desmond and Sterling Hayes were already seated at the plaintiff's table. They looked like a photograph from a financial magazine. Desmond wore a crisp navy pinstripe suit. his hair perfectly styled, casually scrolling through his phone. Sterling was organizing a pristine stack of manila folders, his silver fountain pen glinting in the harsh fluorescent light. When they heard my sensible heels clicking against the linoleum, they looked up. Sterling's eyes flicked to the empty space behind me, searching for my lawyer. When he realized I was alone, a fleeting look of annoyance crossed his face, the look a man gives a mosquito before he swats it. Desmond just checked his platinum watch, his posture radiating the bored impatience of a man waiting for a delayed flight. He thought this was going to be a quick execution. I took my seat at this defense table. It felt vast and empty. I didn't unpack a laptop or a mountain of files. I took out 2 yellow legal pads and 3 sharpened pencils. I placed them parallel to the edge of the table. I folded my hands in my lap, and I waited. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Harrison Caldwell entered from chambers. He was a formidable man in his late 50s, known for his sharp intellect and absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics. He settled into his high-backed leather chair, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked down at the docket. "We are here for the preliminary hearing in the matter of the estate of Arthur Vance," Judge Caldwell announced, his voice carrying an easy, booming authority. "Mr. Hayes, I see you represent the plaintiff, Desmond Vance." "Yes, Your Honor," Sterling said, standing up smoothly and buttoning his jacket. Judge Caldwell's gaze shifted across the aisle to me. He frowned. He looked at my simple navy suit, my graying hair, and my distinct lack of legal counsel. "And the defense?" Judge Caldwell asked, leaning forward slightly. "Mrs. Vance, where is your attorney?" I stood up. I kept my posture deferential. I needed them to believe the narrative they had created for me just a little longer. "I do not have counsel, Your Honor," I said quietly. "I will be representing myself pro se." A low murmur rippled through the handful of law clerks and spectators in the gallery. Sterling Hayes let out a soft, highly calculated sigh. He stepped out from behind his table. "Your Honor, if I may, my client is deeply concerned by this development. This estate involves complex corporate holdings, offshore logistics contracts, and intricate tax structures. We are dealing with a woman who has not held formal employment in 2 decades. Allowing an unrepresented, financially illiterate widow to navigate a probate case of this magnitude will inevitably cause massive delays and waste this court's valuable time." Desmond leaned back, crossing his arms. He didn't say a word, letting his high-priced bulldog do the biting. Judge Caldwell looked at me with a mixture of pity and strict judicial concern. "Mrs. Vance, representing yourself in a contested probate trial is highly unadvisable. The rules of civil procedure are unforgiving. I cannot give you leniency or legal advice from the bench simply because you lack representation. Are you absolutely certain you cannot secure a lawyer? I can grant a brief continuance if you need time to liquidate personal assets." I looked at Sterling. He knew my assets were frozen. He had frozen them. This was part of his strategy, to let the judge know how unreasonable I was being. "I am certain, Your Honor," I replied softly, keeping my eyes fixed on the bench. "I am prepared to proceed." Judge Caldwell pressed his lips together, clearly unhappy, but he nodded. "Very well. The defense proceeds pro se. Mr. Hayes, you may present your opening statement." Sterling Hayes walked to the center of the floor. He didn't yell. He didn't pound his fist on the podium. He used a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice taking on a tone of deep, manufactured sorrow. "This is not a case about greed. This is a tragedy about a woman who simply broke under the pressure." I sat perfectly still, watching him. "Eleanor Vance was a devoted wife," Sterling continued, pacing slowly. "For nearly 20 years, she lived a quiet, comfortable life provided by my client's father. But 2 years ago, Arthur Vance's heart began to fail. He required round-the-clock care. The physical and emotional toll of caregiving is immense, Your Honor. It can change a person. It can make them desperate. It can make them controlling." Sterling stopped and looked at me with a look of profound, sickening pity. "The evidence will show that in Arthur's final 18 months, Eleanor Vance became dangerously isolated. She fired his private nurses, claiming she could do it better. She restricted visits from his only son, Desmond, creating a barrier between a dying father and his child. She became the gatekeeper to Arthur's medication, his food, and his reality. Desmond looked down at the table, playing the part of the grieving, alienated son flawlessly. In that state of absolute dependency, Sterling's voice hardened just a fraction. A vulnerable, heavily medicated man was presented with a new will, a will that entirely disinherited his own flesh and blood, leaving an $80 million empire solely to his isolated, overwhelmed caregiver. We are not asking this court to punish Eleanor Vance. We are simply asking this court to recognize that Arthur Vance lacked the testamentary capacity to make that decision and to restore the estate to its rightful logical heir. Sterling sat down. It was a brilliant opening statement. He hadn't painted me as an evil mastermind. He had painted me as a tragic, exhausted old woman who had lost her moral compass under stress. It was a narrative society readily accepts about women my age. "Mrs. Vance," Judge Caldwell said heavily, "do you have an opening statement?" I stood up. I looked at the legal pad in front of me. The best prosecutors know that sometimes silence is your most terrifying weapon. If you don't speak, the defense doesn't know what you're holding. "The defense waives its opening statement at this time, Your Honor," I said simply and sat back down. Sterling blinked. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his face. Pro se defendants almost never waive their opening statements. They usually use the opportunity to ramble emotionally about how unfair everything is. My procedural discipline was a tiny microscopic crack in his confident facade. "Very well," Judge Caldwell said, raising an eyebrow. "Mr. Hayes, call your first witness." "The plaintiff calls Beatrice Jenkins to the stand," Sterling announced. The pencil in my hand snapped. The sharp crack echoed loudly in the quiet courtroom. I stopped breathing. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom slowly pushed open. It was Bea. She was wearing her best floral Sunday dress, the one we had picked out together at Macy's 3 years ago. She clutched her worn leather Bible to her chest with both hands. Her steps were slow, heavy, and dragging. "No," I thought, a cold, metallic taste flooding my mouth. "No, not Bea. Please, God, not Bea." Desmond had frozen my accounts. He had tried to throw me out of my home. I expected that. He was a stranger passing through my life. But Beatrice? Beatrice was my sister. We had spent 15 years in that kitchen. We had cried together over the kitchen sink when Arthur was diagnosed. We had prayed together. She knew the truth of my marriage better than anyone on this earth. Bea walked down the center aisle. She kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the floor. She refused to look in my direction. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the bailiff asked. "I do," Bea whispered. Her voice was trembling so badly it barely registered on the microphone. She took her seat in the witness box. Sterling Hayes approached her with the gentle, reassuring smile of a pastor comforting a widow. "Mrs. Jenkins, thank you for being here today. I know this is incredibly difficult," Sterling said softly. "Could you tell the court how long you were employed by the Vance household?" 15 years, sir," Bea said, staring at her hands. "And during those 15 years you lived on the property? In the guest cottage?" "Yes, sir." "So you observed the dynamic of their marriage intimately, especially during Mr. Vance's final 2 years when his health began to severely decline. You were there every day?" "Yes, sir. Cooking, cleaning, helping Miss Ellie." Sterling nodded sympathetically. "Mrs. Jenkins, we are here today because Desmond Vance believes his father was manipulated and isolated in his final months. Did you ever witness Eleanor Vance exhibiting controlling, abusive, or isolating behavior toward her husband?" The courtroom held its breath. The silence was agonizing. I stared at Bea. I silently pleaded with her across the room. "Look at me, Bea. Remember the nights we stayed up holding cold compresses to his head? Tell them the truth. Tell them how much I loved him." Bea swallowed hard. A single thick tear rolled down her cheek, catching in the deep lines around her mouth. "Yes, sir," she choked out. I did. A triumphant, deeply ugly smirk spread across Desmond's face. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. I felt physically ill. The betrayal was a physical weight crushing my chest. "Could you elaborate for the court, Mrs. Jenkins?" Sterling prompted, his voice like velvet. "Take your time." "Miss Eleanor, she changed," Bea lied, her voice shaking violently. "When Mr. Arthur got really sick, she stopped letting his friends visit. She fired the night nurse. She said we didn't need strangers in the house." "Did she ever restrict Desmond Vance from visiting his father?" "Yes," Bea whispered. "Desmond would call, and Miss Ellie would hang up the phone. She told the security gate not to let his car in." "And did she ever display aggression toward Arthur?" Sterling pressed, moving closer to the witness box. B closed her eyes. Sometimes, when he was confused, she would yell at him. She would bring him these thick stacks of legal papers. She told him that if he didn't sign them, she would put him in the cheap state nursing home on 43rd Street and leave him there to rot alone. The gallery erupted in shocked whispers. I sat frozen at the defense table. Every word was a dagger. Every lie was a meticulous, calculated assassination of my character. The state nursing home on 43rd Street? I had never even heard of it. Sterling had fed her these specific details to make the lie sound authentic. "Why, B?" my mind screamed. "Why are you doing this?" "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins," Sterling said finally, looking at the judge with profound sadness. "Your Honor, the plaintiff has no further questions for this witness. It pains us to hear how Arthur Vance suffered in his own home, but the truth must be brought to light." Sterling walked back to his table and sat down. He had done it. He had taken my closest ally and turned her into the bullet that would kill my case. Judge Caldwell looked down at me from the bench. His expression was grim. "Mrs. Vance," Judge Caldwell said, his voice echoing in the tense room, "do you wish to cross-examine the witness?" Judge Caldwell's voice echoed in the heavy silence of courtroom 302. "Mrs. Vance, do you wish to cross-examine the witness?" I closed my eyes for exactly 3 seconds. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I didn't see Beatrice, the woman who had just driven a knife into my back. I saw the fear in her posture. I saw the way her knuckles were white from gripping that Bible. I knew human nature. I had spent 15 years dissecting it on witness stands across the state. A woman like B, God-fearing, loyal, and deeply principled, does not commit perjury in a federal courthouse unless a gun is being held to the head of someone she loves more than her own soul. Desmond hadn't just bought her off. He had broken her. The grief that had been paralyzing me for a month suddenly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, sharp, and absolute clarity. The iron prosecutor woke up. I opened my eyes. The tears were completely gone. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice was no longer the soft, hesitant whisper of a grieving widow. It was measured, resonant, and unnervingly calm. I stood up. I didn't take my yellow legal pad. I didn't need notes. I stepped out from behind the heavy wooden defense table, smoothed the front of my navy blazer, and walked toward the center of the room. The rhythmic click-click-click of my heels against the marble floor was the only sound in the courtroom. Sterling Hayes frowned, shifting in his leather chair. Desmond sat up a little straighter, his confident posture wavering just a fraction. I stopped 6 feet away from the witness box. I clasped my hands loosely behind my back. "Hello, B," I said quietly. B flinched as if I had struck her. She couldn't lift her chin. "Hello, Miss Ellie." "B, you just testified under oath that on the evening of Tuesday, October 12th, you heard me screaming at Arthur in his study. You testified that I threatened to put him in a state facility if he didn't sign a new will. Is that your testimony?" "Yes," she whispered to her lap. "You stated you were in the kitchen preparing dinner, meatloaf, Arthur's favorite, when you heard this." "Yes, Miss Ellie." I nodded slowly, tilting my head. "B, you and I designed that kitchen together during the remodel 5 years ago, didn't we? Do you remember the insulation we chose?" Sterling Hayes stood up instantly. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? We are not here to discuss home renovations." "Sustained," Judge Caldwell said, looking at me with a warning in his eyes. "Mrs. Vance, please get to the point." "The point, Your Honor, is physics," I said smoothly, not taking my eyes off B. "B, the study is on the 2nd floor, in the far east wing of a 10,000-square-foot house. The kitchen is on the 1st floor, in the west wing. There are exactly 4 solid oak doors, a carpeted staircase, and 70 feet of hallway between them. During the remodel, we specifically paid for acoustic drywall so Arthur wouldn't be disturbed by the kitchen blender while he was working." B's breathing hitched. "So I ask you again, B," I said, my voice cutting through the air with surgical precision. "If I were screaming in that study, a person standing in that soundproofed kitchen couldn't hear a fire alarm, let alone a conversation. How exactly did you hear me?" B looked up, absolute panic flashing in her eyes. She glanced at Sterling. Sterling's jaw tightened. I must have been in the hallway bringing up laundry," B stammered, her hands trembling violently. "Ah, the laundry," I said, taking one deliberate step closer. "But B, October 12th was a Tuesday. In 15 years, you have never done laundry on a Tuesday. Tuesdays are your days to take the train to Oak Park to visit your sister. In fact, you weren't even in the house on the evening of October 12th. You didn't return until Wednesday morning." "Objection! The defendant is testifying," Sterling barked, his face reddening. "I am establishing a timeline of physical impossibility, Your Honor," I fired back instantly, my tone commanding enough that Judge Caldwell raised an eyebrow but waved me on. "Overruled. Proceed, Mrs. Vance." I leaned my arms gently on the wooden rail of the witness box. I lowered my voice so only B, the judge, and the court reporter could hear the intimacy in it. "Look at me, Beatrice," I commanded softly. Slowly, agonizingly, she lifted her head. Her eyes were red and swollen, brimming with terror. "You love Arthur. You love me," I said, stripping away the legal posturing. "You are holding a Bible. You would not damn your soul for Desmond Vance unless you had no other choice." "Objection, badgering the witness!" Sterling yelled. I ignored him completely. My eyes locked onto B's. "How is your nephew, Kevin?" B let out a sharp, guttural gasp. The color drained entirely from her face. She dropped the Bible. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. Behind me, I heard a chair scrape violently against the floor. Desmond had bolted upright, his smugness vanishing into thin air. "Kevin is 22, I continued relentlessly, my voice rising in volume, filling the courtroom. "He works as an inventory manager at Desmond's logistics warehouse on the south side. A good boy, but he got into some online gambling debt last year, didn't he?" "I know, because you cried on my shoulder about it in January." "Stop," B sobbed, shaking her head frantically. "Did Desmond find out?" I pressed, stepping into her line of sight so she couldn't look away. "Did Desmond find out Kevin was skimming from the warehouse crates to pay off his bookie? Is that it, B? Did Desmond threaten to send your only nephew to federal prison for grand larceny unless you sat in this chair today and lied to destroy me?" "Objection. Your Honor, this is outrageous." Sterling Hayes was screaming now, waving his arms, his professional composure completely shattered. "These are baseless, defamatory accusations from a desperate housewife." "I didn't want to, Ellie," B wailed, breaking down completely, her cries echoing off the high ceilings. She covered her face with her hands, rocking back and forth. "He showed me the security tapes. He said he'd ruin Kevin's life. He said if I just said what his lawyer told me to say, he'd wipe Kevin's debt clean." "I'm sorry, Ellie. Lord forgive me, I'm so sorry." Total chaos erupted in the courtroom. The gallery gasped. Reporters started furiously typing on their phones. Desmond was frantic, whispering aggressively at Sterling, his face pale with panic. "Order! Order in this court!" Judge Caldwell slammed his gavel down repeatedly, the sharp wooden clacks cutting through the noise. He pointed the gavel at the witness box. "Mrs. Jenkins, are you testifying under oath that the plaintiff, Desmond Vance, suborned your perjury through extortion?" "Yes, Your Honor," B cried out, looking up at the bench. "Everything I said today was a lie. Miss Ellie was an angel to that man. She loved him. Desmond made me do it." "Your Honor," Sterling Hayes shouted, practically sprinting to the center of the room. He was sweating. "I move for an immediate mistrial. The defendant is manipulating an emotionally unstable witness. She is making wild, unsubstantiated claims. This is exactly why an uneducated, legally illiterate housewife cannot be permitted to represent herself. She has no respect for the rules of civil procedure. She is circumventing evidentiary standards, and she is making an absolute mockery of your courtroom." I didn't sit down. I stood perfectly still, smoothing my navy blazer. I turned slowly and looked at Sterling Hayes. I gave him a look so cold, so entirely devoid of fear, that he actually stopped talking and took a half-step back. "Mr. Hayes," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy, resonant timbre of a woman used to sending dangerous men to maximum security prisons. "I assure you, my understanding of evidentiary standards is quite intimate, and my claim of extortion is not unsubstantiated. As of this morning, I have drafted a subpoena request for the security footage of Desmond Vance's warehouse, as well as a forensic audit of Kevin Jenkins' bank records. I believe they will show a distinct pattern of embezzlement that your client knew of, concealed and weaponized to commit fraud upon this court." Sterling stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man who had just tried to kick a stray dog, only to realize he had provoked a sleeping lioness. Judge Caldwell leaned slowly over his bench. He took off his reading glasses. He stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He looked at my posture. He listened to the precise, clinical legal terminology I had just deployed flawlessly without a single note in front of me. Mrs. Vance, Judge Caldwell said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the dead silent room. Before we proceed with the catastrophic implosion of the plaintiff's case, I need to ask you a question. Yes, Your Honor? I replied, keeping my chin perfectly level. When we began these proceedings this morning, you introduced yourself simply as Eleanor Vance. For the official court record, and for my own sanity, I need you to state your full legal maiden name, the name you held before you married Arthur Vance 20 years ago. Desmond looked confused, glancing wildly between the judge and his lawyer. Sterling Hayes suddenly looked like he was going to be physically sick. I stood tall. I let 20 years of dust blow off my shoulders. My name, I said, my voice echoing with absolute clarity, is Eleanor Vance, formerly known as Eleanor Vance Carter. Judge Caldwell dropped his pen. It hit the wooden bench with a sharp clatter. He sat back in his large leather chair, rubbing his hand over his face. When he looked back at me, the pity was entirely gone. It was replaced by profound, unmistakable respect and a touch of awe. Eleanor Vance Carter, Judge Caldwell repeated slowly, letting the name hang in the heavy air. As in, former Chief Federal Prosecutor Carter, the Iron Prosecutor of the Northern District, the woman who dismantled the Genovese financial syndicate in 1998? Yes, Your Honor, I replied simply. I retired early to care for my family. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Desmond stumbled backward, hitting his chair. What is he talking about? Sterling, what is he talking about? She's just a housewife. She's a nobody. Sterling Hayes didn't answer him. The high-priced, arrogant lawyer was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. He knew exactly who I was. Every lawyer of a certain age in Chicago knew the name Eleanor Carter. I hadn't just practiced law. I had been a terror to white-collar criminals across the Midwest. I had a conviction rate of 96%. I turned my head slowly and locked eyes with Desmond. You made a mistake, Desmond, I said, my voice soft but laced with pure steel. You thought because I wore a cardigan and baked pies, I had forgotten how to gut a liar on a witness stand. You thought you could freeze my bank accounts and starve me out. But you forgot one crucial thing. What? Desmond stammered, shrinking back into his chair. I didn't need Arthur's money to fight you, I said, a predator finally showing her teeth. I just needed a courtroom. When I unlocked the front door of my house that evening, the air inside felt different. For a month, this 10,000-square-foot mansion had felt like a mausoleum. Now it felt like a command center. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pour a glass of wine. I walked straight into the kitchen, brewed a pot of the strongest black coffee I had, and carried it upstairs to Arthur's study. Arthur was a brilliant, old-school businessman. He didn't trust cloud storage, biometric passwords, or corporate servers for the things that truly mattered. When I had asked him, years ago, what I should do if anything ever happened to him, he had kissed my temple, pointed to the wall, and said, "Look behind the city we built, Ellie." I walked over to the large framed vintage map of Chicago hanging behind his heavy mahogany desk. I gripped the ornate wooden frame, lifted it off its heavy brass hooks, and set it carefully on the floor. Behind it, flush with the dark oak paneling, was a small steel wall safe. I inputted our wedding anniversary. The heavy locking mechanism clicked open with a satisfying metallic thud. Inside the dark cavity lay a single battered leather notebook, its gold leaf lettering worn away by decades of use, and a small silver USB drive. The faded ledger. I took them down to the kitchen table, plugged the USB drive into my laptop, and held my breath. A video file appeared on the screen. I clicked it, and suddenly my husband was looking back at me. He was in his hospital bed in our living room. His face was gaunt, the oxygen tubes resting against his pale cheeks, but his bright blue eyes were as sharp and full of love as the day we met. "My beautiful Ellie," Arthur's recorded voice cracked. I covered my mouth, feeling a fresh wave of grief, but I forced myself to watch. "If you are watching this, it means my heart finally gave out, and my worst fears have come true," Arthur continued, taking a ragged, painful breath. "It means Desmond has come for you." He paused, looking down at his hands before meeting the camera's lens again. "I know he thinks you manipulated me. I know he probably hired some ruthless bulldog lawyer to try and bully you out of your home. But Ellie, my sweet, brilliant wife, I didn't leave you my empire because you are my wife. I left it to you because you are Eleanor Carter, and you are the only person on this earth smart enough and ruthless enough to save it." I frowned, leaning closer to the glowing screen. Save it? Arthur's logistics company, Vance Freight, was valued at over $80 million. What did it need saving from? "The company is bleeding out, Ellie," Arthur confessed, answering my silent question. His voice was heavy with shame. "On paper, it looks like a gold mine, but the truth is, we are drowning in massive, unexplainable debt. We are weeks away from defaulting on federal loans. If I left the company to Desmond, the creditors would strip it down to the studs, and he would end up with nothing anyway. I tried to figure it out, but I got too sick, too fast. My mind is cloudy. I can't follow the numbers anymore." He reached a trembling hand toward the camera, as if trying to touch my face. "I left you everything, Ellie, because I need my iron prosecutor to dig into the books. I need you to find the rot. I'm sorry to leave you a war zone, my love, but I know you will win." The video faded to black. I sat frozen in the silence of my kitchen. Twist number 4 hit me with staggering force. Desmond wasn't fighting for an $80 million fortune. He was fighting for a bankrupt shell of a company. But why? Desmond was greedy, yes, but he wasn't stupid. Sterling Hayes certainly wasn't stupid. They had to know the company was failing. So why spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, risk disbarment, and extort a housekeeper just to steal a sinking ship? Unless... I grabbed the faded ledger. This was Arthur's personal shadow accounting, his handwritten records of the company's vital signs. I opened my laptop and pulled up the limited financial disclosures Sterling had been forced to file with the probate court. I put on my reading glasses. I opened the first page of the ledger, and for the next 9 hours, I didn't move. I tracked routing numbers. I cross-referenced offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands with vendor payments made by Vance Freight over the last 5 years. I looked at the exact dates Arthur's health began to fail, matching them with massive unexplained hemorrhages of cash masked as logistics consulting fees. At 4 a.m., the numbers finally clicked together. The puzzle was complete, and the truth was so monstrous, it took my breath away. Desmond hadn't sued me out of grief. He hadn't sued me out of greed for his inheritance. Desmond sued me out of absolute, sheer terror. Over the last 5 years, while Arthur was battling heart disease, Desmond had been quietly embezzling company funds. He hadn't just stolen a little. He had drained nearly $42 million into an offshore account. Desmond was the reason the empire was collapsing. He had bled his own father dry. When Arthur died, Desmond knew the estate would go into probate. He knew that if I, his supposedly ignorant housewife stepmother, inherited the company, I would eventually have to hire an accountant to file the taxes. And the moment an accountant looked at those books, Desmond's theft would be discovered. He would be facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The emergency injunction, the forged power of attorney, the defamation lawsuit. It was all a frantic, desperate smokescreen. Desmond needed to freeze me out and gain absolute control of the estate immediately so he could bury the evidence, seal the records, and liquidate the company before anyone realized what he had done. He thought I was just an uneducated old woman he could bully into walking away. He had no idea he had just handed a $40 million federal wire fraud case directly to the former chief prosecutor of the Northern District. I closed the ledger. I took off my glasses and looked out the kitchen window. The sun was beginning to rise over Chicago, painting the sky in streaks of cold gold and bruised purple. "You wanted to go to court, Desmond," I whispered to the empty room, feeling the cold, hard steel of justice settling into my bones. "Then let's go to court." When I walked into courtroom 302 that morning, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The gallery was packed to standing room only. Word had spread through the downtown law firms overnight that Eleanor Carter had come out of retirement and was currently defending herself in a probate trial. Young lawyers, seasoned partners, and journalists were crammed into the wooden pews, waiting to see the iron prosecutor at work. Desmond looked physically ill. His skin was gray, and he was sweating through his expensive suit. He kept checking the exit doors. Sterling Hayes looked like he hadn't slept at all. His pristine arrogance had been entirely replaced by the nervous energy of a man trying to survive a sinking ship. "All rise." Judge Caldwell took the bench. He looked at the packed gallery, then gave me a brief, respectful nod before turning his stern gaze to the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Hayes, after yesterday's explosive revelations regarding your witness, how does the plaintiff wish to proceed?" Sterling stood up. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Your Honor, he said, his voice completely lacking its usual polished cadence. In light of recent emotional distress within the family, my client has decided to drop the lawsuit. We withdraw our petition to contest the will. We concede the estate to Mrs. Vance. We ask for an immediate dismissal with prejudice so these files can be sealed and this family can grieve in peace. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Desmond let out a loud, shuddering breath of relief. They were trying to cut their losses and run. If the case was dismissed and sealed, the financial records would be buried forever, and Desmond could disappear before I looked closely at the money. I stood up. I didn't rush. I smoothed my navy skirt, picked up Arthur's faded ledger, and walked to the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, I said, my voice ringing out, clear and lethal. The defense vehemently objects to the dismissal. Sterling whipped his head around, staring at me in absolute horror. You object to winning? Mrs. Vance, we are surrendering the estate to you. I am not here for a surrender, Mr. Hayes, I said coldly, fixing him with a stare that made him swallow hard. And I am certainly not here for a dismissal. I am here for a reckoning. I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, yesterday, the plaintiff entered into the public record accusations that I committed elder abuse and financial manipulation. I have the right to clear my name by presenting my evidence and calling my final witness. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a jurist about to watch a master class. Objection to dismissal sustained. Call your witness, Mrs. Vance. The defense calls the plaintiff, Desmond Vance, to the stand. Desmond practically fell out of his chair. No! I dropped the case. I don't want to testify. Sterling, do something. You opened the door to this courtroom, Mr. Vance, Judge Caldwell barked, pointing his heavy wooden gavel at the witness box. Take the stand. Now. Trembling like a leaf, his bespoke suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for him, Desmond walked up and swore the oath. He sank into the chair, looking at me as if I were the Grim Reaper himself. Mr. Vance, I began, pacing slowly in front of him. I handed a thick stack of audited bank statements to the bailiff to pass up to the judge. Let's talk about the finances you were so desperately trying to protect from me. Are you familiar with a Cayman Islands holding company called Apex Logistics Solutions? Desmond swallowed so hard I heard it from 6 feet away. I don't know what that is. You don't? I walked back to my table and picked up a piece of paper I had printed at 5 a.m. I handed a copy to Sterling and a copy to the judge. Your Honor, I submit Defense Exhibit A, a series of wire transfers spanning 5 years, totaling $42 million, moved from Arthur Vance's corporate accounts to Apex Logistics Solutions, all billed as consulting fees. I turned back to Desmond, my voice rising in volume and absolute power. Desmond, my husband was a brilliant man, but his heart was failing. He trusted you to manage the vendor accounts. I pulled the corporate registry for the Cayman Islands last night. Do you know who holds the sole signatory rights to the Apex offshore account? Desmond looked at Sterling in blind panic. Sterling closed his eyes, rubbed his temples, and offered a barely perceptible nod. He was distancing himself. He was throwing his client to the wolves to save his own law license. On the advice of counsel, Desmond choked out, his voice shaking violently, I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The gallery erupted in gasps. You invoke the Fifth, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, razor-sharp whisper. In a civil probate hearing. How fascinating. In a criminal trial, pleading the Fifth cannot be used against you. But in a civil trial, invoking the Fifth Amendment allows the judge to draw an adverse inference. It is the legal equivalent of waving a white flag and admitting you have something criminal to hide. Desmond had just handed me the case on a silver platter. I turned to Judge Caldwell. Your Honor, I submit Defense Exhibit B, my late husband's personal ledger, cross-referenced with the plaintiff's signature on the forged power of attorney, used to freeze my accounts. Desmond Vance didn't sue me because he thought I manipulated his father. He sued me to silence me. He used this court, and he used a fraudulent lawsuit to cover up a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme that bankrupted his own father's legacy. Stop, Desmond cried out, burying his face in his hands, openly sobbing on the stand. He was always going to give it all to you. I deserved that money. It was my birthright. I was his son. Your birthright? I thundered, my voice echoing off the marble walls, vibrating with 20 years of suppressed rage and grief. Arthur Vance's legacy was built on integrity. You stole from a dying man. You blackmailed an innocent elderly housekeeper. You dragged my name through the mud, froze my accounts, and tried to leave me starving in the street. You are not an heir, Desmond. You are a thief, and this court is done with you." I turned back to the bench, standing taller than I had in 20 years. "Your Honor, I ask that the court uphold the will in its entirety, dissolve the emergency injunctions permanently, and refer this matter, along with all financial exhibits, immediately to the United States Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution regarding wire fraud, extortion, and perjury." Judge Caldwell looked at the ledger, looked at the weeping man on the stand, and then looked at me. He nodded slowly, profoundly. "Judgment for the defense on all counts," Judge Caldwell declared, slamming his gavel down with absolute finality. "The will stands. The injunctions are lifted. Mr. Hayes, I suggest you advise your client to remain in the building. I am having the bailiff contact the FBI and the U.S. Marshals. Mr. Vance will be taken into federal custody pending an indictment." Desmond wailed as 2 armed bailiffs moved in to flank him. Sterling Hayes packed his briefcase, didn't look at his client, and practically ran out of the courtroom. I stood there in the center of the room. The gallery erupted into thunderous applause, but I barely heard it. I looked up at the high ceiling, placing a hand over my heart, feeling the steady, strong beat beneath my ribs. "We did it, Arthur," I thought, letting out a long, shuddering breath. "The Empire is safe. It has been 8 months since that day in courtroom 302. Desmond Vance didn't make it to trial. Faced with the mountain of forensic evidence I handed to the FBI, he took a plea deal. He is currently serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. Sterling Hayes was stripped of his law license and is facing a disciplinary hearing from the State Bar Association for his role in submitting forged documents. As for me, I didn't go back to being a quiet housewife. With Arthur's company legally mine, I liquidated the remaining physical assets to pay off the legitimate creditors. I saved Arthur's good name, ensuring no employee or vendor was left unpaid. With the money I recovered from Desmond's offshore accounts, I didn't buy a yacht or a vacation home. I bought a small, beautiful office building downtown. Today, a polished brass plaque hangs on the front door. It reads, "The Fated Ledger Foundation, Legal Defense for Widows and the Elderly." I provide pro bono legal counsel and forensic accounting for older women whose families try to strip them of their rights, their money, and their dignity. B, completely forgiven and freed from Desmond's blackmail, runs the front desk. She welcomes every frightened, overwhelmed woman who walks through our doors with a hot cup of chamomile tea, a warm hug, and the assurance that they are no longer alone. Society loves to look at an older woman and see someone who is past her prime. They see gray hair, sensible shoes, and soft cardigans, and they assume we are weak, uneducated, or easily discarded. They mistake our chosen peace for an inability to fight. But let my story be a warning to anyone who thinks they can prey on the elderly. You never know who you are dealing with. A woman's worth does not expire with age. Our minds do not dull just because our hair turns silver. And sometimes the quietest housewives are the ones who know exactly how to burn your lies to the ground. Thank you so much for listening to my journey. If you found strength in this story, please share it with a friend, leave a like, and hit that subscribe button. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you found Arthur's ledger? Until next time, stay strong, know your worth, and never ever let anyone tell you that you are just anything.